trampoline.
Yes, exactly.
Hi, Stephano, how you doing?
I'm good.
So we're going to talk about TV, but the one thing we should quickly do is give you you have some digital credentials as well. We just give 30 seconds on your background so people know that you came from digital before you made this leap into the TV world.
Sure. Did a brief stint in AOL, took that fiasco to another level, and then went over to a company called X+1 and worked on some early stuff in DMPs and what eventually became DMPs and DSPs and all that fancy stuff. And then I went over to the social side and wanted to see what the hell Facebook was all about, and Twitter and all the other fun stuff. And then really got tired of ad tech and kind of dropped out of the scene. And tried my hand at e-commerce and things like selling vitamins and stuff. And then came back and got suckered into the world of television.
Suckered.
And so here I am.
There we go. All right.
Around town and back again.
All right. So let's talk about TV. So, and let's start from the discussion as it says, programmatic television means something, but what, as it says there. So let's start there, which is when you think about the word programmatic in a TV-centered environment, what the heck does that mean to you?
I have no idea.
Right.
You know, so it's funny, like when you and I were there in the early days, and the term programmatic never existed, right? It was real-time bidding. It was even real-time bidding wasn't there. It was just like an open auction of inventory. You know, for us at Turner, and this is beyond just television, but for all of our ad products, we're going to start to move into a place where, programmatic has become this gigantic amorphous word. Like, quite frankly, I just don't know what it means anymore, right? And when you have, dozens of people with each having a different definition of it, it becomes a meaningless word, right? Yeah. And so, we're starting to move into a place where for all of our ad products, we're going to be a little more specific, right? So we have indirect channels and we have direct channels where retail sales forces sell those things. We start selling in, reserved and guaranteed and audience-driven, and these are things that kind of dimensionalize the inventory that we're selling to advertisers and to their agencies. And we'll start to move up the stack and have kind of our direct sales force go back to building these things, right, based on the relationships and what they know about our clients.
Yeah. So I know this, but I think it's good nuance. It's not that you're anti the trends that we've now adopted this word of, quote, programmatic as shorthand for automation, data-driven intelligence. I know that's a lot of what you're spending your time doing. I think we'll come back to the marketplace nature of the programmatic discussion in a second, but let's just talk about the automation side, which I know, again, the data and the automation side is what you spend a ton of your time on. It's what you're helping Turner build. First, I think, maybe a quick first on help people understand how much automation work needs to be done under the pipes of the TV system.
There's a ton of automation there already, right? And this is 25, 30-year technology. I think our youngest television system is maybe 5 to 10 years old, right? When it comes to now moving from a day part orientation and moving towards an audience-driven one, the level of automation needed to now characterize the inventory, to value it, and then to transact, right, with the buy side, there's quite amount of distance between us, right? We're talking about automating the log and trafficking systems, right? For instance, if you're looking at CNN, where every day there's a breaking news environment, right? It's very hard to predict, right, the audience that's going to tune in at any given moment. When you look at, the NBA Finals, right, and if Game 2 goes into overtime, it's hard to predict how much additional tune-in, right, we're going to get, right, in that overtime. And so when we start to look at those things, we start to dimensionalize that inventory. It's really hard to then standardize, right, for ourselves what that automation looks like. Now you take it a step further and say, okay, in this audience-driven world, right, what is going to be the currency, for instance, right? Is it Nielsen? Well, Nielsen doesn't give us credit for anything for people above 49 years old. Last time I checked, 50-year-olds buy plenty of automobiles, right? A lot of them go to McDonald's, and quite frankly, they spend a ton of money in the grocery store, right? And so, so the currency and the measurement issue becomes another factor, and then all of a sudden, I go over and say, have all those things solved, right? We've resolved all those things, and we walk over to our best clients at our agencies and our advertisers, and what we find is that there's an overwhelming willingness, right, and desire to transact on that level. And the challenge becomes is that the buy side also, right, has years of how things have been done, right? And I think in television, in the digital space, what I found is that the buy side kind of, built up first, right, on the technology and on the data side. In television, it's been very much publisher driven from what I can tell, right? And so ultimately, when I go and see these buyers, they're like, great, I want to buy that auto intender on TBS and TNT, and we've done all this work to take all of our day parts and bring it to an audience level. And then our buyers will say, now can you map that back to my day parts, right? Because all their investment models have been built, right, on a day part method, right? And so these are things that we're now working through, right, before we even get to the steps around automation.
Yeah, got it. So the currency piece, the measurement piece, it's fundamentally a data conversation. You talked about this notion of targeting an auto intender on TV. I think for many in this room, they'd go, wait a minute, what? Right? So how do you do that? You are building part of your job as the chief data strategist, right, is to stitch all that together. So help explain a bit more about what data are you going to source and what's the objective of putting that data together? How do you're creating audience profiles of some sort, I guess a little bit of how and then the why.
Yeah, no, it's, so that's a challenge in and of itself, right? So like a unit, right, in television at any given time, again, we don't know prior. We have a good estimation, but we don't know prior as to how big that unit is, right, in terms of frequency, in terms of reach, in terms of what have you at that given moment, right? But we have, given past data and given data sets that come in from places like Nielsen and from Catalina and from other places, we get a good dimensionality of like how that, I would say that unit indexes in terms of certain types of behavior, right? Because they've done the work of fusing that data set together.
In the unit, you're talking about a 30-second commercial.
Potentially, right?
Okay. As an example.
As an example,
Okay.
right? And so now the work that we're trying to do is trying to find alternative data sources that can either be fused with the current Nielsen currency, right? Potentially a Rentrack currency, right? As well as, where we can start to measure and correlate outcomes, right? And where we can start to roll up digital assets, right? That are on an individual impression basis, right? Or a unique basis. And how do you start to roll that up into some, common key? Is that a zip code? Is that a household? Or what is that, right?
Yeah.
So just in the managing that data and kind of bringing these data sources together is also just a ton of work,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, it doesn't, obviously you can't match it to a cookie like you can in the digital world.
We're trying, right, exactly.
Okay, but that's not, I mean, the end state, I guess it could be, let's talk about a couple of things you and I have talked about in the past. There's this notion of data from, quote, in the glass. That's the inside the TV manufacturer data. I'd love you to talk about why is that so interesting. There's set-top box data. Then you're clearly trying to also link to mobile data. Is that all with the intention of knowing exactly when I'm in the room and exactly what I'm watching? And is that realistic?
Yes and no. So, taking a step back, so like part of the reason why I joined Turner about a year ago is, when I sat down with the executive committee, like their intention, right, is that they want to move from being just a television company, right, the world's greatest cable television company, right, to a content creation and distribution business. And when you think about that, like, what does that mean, right? It means ultimately we need to develop a relationship with the end consumer. And, Turner, Time Warner is a massive portfolio of fantastic consumer-facing brands, but we're a B2B company, right? Like, we get paid by WPP and Publicis and OMD, as well as Comcast and Cablevision and Charter, right? And so more and more, right, when we think about bringing in data or the use of data, it's really to optimize the user experience, right? So no longer is our product just premium content, right, which is now also a loose definition. But it's premium content wrapped up in a fantastic user experience, which we at Turner have a lot of ground to cover, but then characterized by the data as a proxy of who that person is, who's engaging with that. And I think ultimately if we start giving them a superior experience, inclusive of the ad experience that's with them, right, then that's when we're going to see results.
So what is, just as one really granular example, I think it's interesting, when you talk about getting in the glass data from a TV manufacturer, from an LG, a Samsung, or et cetera, what data will that provide?
I think what's most interesting of looking at data behind the glass, as you say, Matthew, is that, when we think about a user experience, I want to make sure that it's holistic, right? And we don't want to treat you as one individual who's watching TV, but another individual who's watching TV and engaging on their mobile device, and another individual who's watching TV, engaging on a mobile device, and perhaps going to the movies or something to that effect, right? Or streaming over the top. And so what we're trying to do is just triangulate like who you are and where are all the touch points that we have. And so what happens is that, you know, what's fascinating about some of the technologies that's coming through television is that they're able to provide me a linkage, right? Maybe not an identifier, but at least a linkage, right? That this consumer, this viewer, right, is touching my brand across these devices, these channels. And I think if we start from there, right, a lot of things happen.
All right, let's talk about the idea of marketplaces, right? So, you know, as you said at the top, you know, the idea that programmatic kind of really doesn't mean something specific. And listen, I echo that. I think we use it too much as a thing and not enough as a methodology and an approach and a kind of a capabilities layer, right? But certainly one of the trends of the programmatic buying discussion is one of marketplaces, both either open or private, guaranteed, non-guaranteed. I know you see a future for the notion of marketplaces in a TV world. As you think about what that looks like, what elements map to the digital world in that TV marketplace world? Are you thinking about bidding? Is that what it's about? Is it about more direct access to inventory? Help everyone understand where does that go from a marketplace perspective.
Yeah, I mean, look, at the end of the day, it's funny. It's like when you think about programmatic, right, you think about like, you know, private auctions and reserves and guarantees. I mean, all those things are elements of what we call an upfront, right? Of a predetermined agreement as to how much inventory at what rates, right, that some of our best buyers are going to consume from us. You know, for the most part, we have visibility into who is going to consume 85 to 90% of our ad inventory, right, for the upcoming year. And so, and then I start to think about, well, you know, Turner aside, you know, the television industry, the broadcast and the cable television companies, they all start to have their own unique challenges, right? So for us, we very rarely have, you know, remnant, for instance, right? We have a scarcity problem, right? And so the notion of auctioning off inventory is interesting, right? If, you know, I have, again, you know, last minute inventory that, again, I couldn't clear, or that I could fetch a higher rate in scatter, right? And it's so high that I would forego some of my upfront commitments, right? But I don't have the challenge of now clearing and auctioning off remnant inventory where other you know, companies may.
The supply and demand is clearly much more level, but so let me just, some specific thoughts. Will there be, in your mind, anytime in the near future, real-time bidding for your primetime television?
For us, in the near future, I don't think so. I mean, look, we have the ability to auction off a unit today, right? So literally we can call up our 10 best advertisers, that creative is loaded into the system, and our head of sales can pick up the phone and call all of them, right? 6 hours before the log gets locked in, right, we can see who wants this, what price do you want it, and we put that ad in, right, before it goes out to the broadcast stream. So we have the ability to auction that today, but ultimately there hasn't been a business case or an urgency to do so, right? What I'd rather do is be in a place where, you know, as we work on things like, you know, with our MVPD partners, is around the whole notion of dynamic ad insertion, right? To the extent that we can not only automate the transaction, but now the value that I can bring is I can vary the creative execution audience by audience, right? You know, as a national television company, you want that definition region by region or person by person, right?
I mean, and that's the important point. Many people might not realize there is no such thing as dynamic ad insertion in television.
There is. It's just not at a scale. It's not at a scale. I mean, I think there's a lot of interesting work being done. You know, Dish recently announced some work that they're doing with, you know, with addressable on, I think it's like roughly 8 million, you know, households. You know, obviously Comcast is working on a bunch of stuff with their set-top boxes, and I'm sure there's addressability in some subset of that 20 million. Right. So the challenge is that I think there's some interesting tests going on, but we're far from standards or level of scale where if you're Mondelez and you want to have a national but addressable advertising campaign, it's extremely difficult to do at scale today.
All right, so the last question, how do you think about, how would you advise you know, the experts in the digital side of the world that are transacting more and more programmatically as they think about how that's going to impact TV buying and in the future the digitization of all of these channels, which is occurring? what would you tell these people to pay attention to? What are the trends they should be watching, or what should they expect is going to be possible with the TV marketplace?
Yeah, I think I'm very fascinated with what's going to happen in VOD. I think for linear, right? We look at the world in terms of linear and non-linear. So for linear, fascinated by what happens in cable VOD over the next couple of years, especially with bandwidth getting optimized into the home. On the other hand, we're obviously watching very carefully with what over-the-top distribution systems and over-the-top MVPDs, so to speak, right? What they look like, and that would be the closest thing to a digital environment, right? Where it's IP delivered. I can get a unique cookie on an individual. I can get some data payload. It's heavily fragmented today, right? I think there's like 5,000 subscribers on like PlayStation, right? I think Apple TV is a closed system, but I think as those systems evolve and they start to come together, I think you might see some interesting scale there where there's a direct analog, current digital environment.
Okay, great. Stephano, thank you very much.
Thank you.